Welcome to DIYeasycrafts and BergKnifemaking.com. Today we're going to take a look at grinding rough bevels. We're actually going to be working on 3 different knife projects. Basically just a night in the shop after work. 2 of these knives are going to be 3/16 thick. The other one is a little bit thicker. It's 1/4 inch thick. All 3 of them are AEBL stainless steel. Now I drew out the basic profiles just with a Sharpie, and then I cut out the majority of the steel with a bandsaw. And then I just profiled the blades right on the 2x72 grinder with a very coarse grit belt. I think I used a 24 or 36 grit. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this video on profiling because I really want to spend the majority of time for this video on grinding the rough bevels. But I did want to give you, show you the basics of how these knives were profiled. So you can do it. You can do them a bunch of ways. You can cut out the profile with a bandsaw. You could just grind everything on the 2x72. You could use a disc grinder. Any way that you want to profile the blades. Other companies, as well as myself, offer blanks that you could buy that are pre-profiled. Makes your life a little bit easier. This is a small wheel attachment for the Origin blade maker. It just makes getting into those finger grooves, a lot easier. And then after the profile was done, I did pre-drill the pinholes, prior to working on the bevels. Notice that big C-clamp on the drill press table. That's to prevent that blade from helicoptering, spinning, in case the bit ever does get caught. So now that the profile is done and the pinholes are drilled, we'll start working on the 3 different knives. I'm not going to show you every bit of grinding. I'm just going to show you the basics here. It starts out, most bevel grinding projects start out by scribing 2 parallel lines on each blade. They're called railroad track lines. They're basically center lines, parallel center lines. And it's this that we're going to use as a visual reference when grinding the bevels on each side of the blade. So I'm going to grind in until I'm just about touching that scribed line. Now I use a tilt table bevel grinding jig. This is a jig that Jason Northgard and I developed last year, and we actually now make them and market them. It's bolted on. I'm using a Origin blade maker, 2x72. Mine has a 2 horsepower, variable speed, plenty of power. I can really lean into it. I can move a lot of material very quickly. Because this first blade that I'm working on is pretty thick. This is 1/4 inch thick. I wanted to remove this material as quick as possible. I'm using a 24 grit belt for the rough grinding. Now, you can't leave it at 24 grit before you harden it. What I would do, or what I did, was I ground the bevels with the 24 grit, and then I cleaned them all up with a 60 grit before I put this blade aside for heat treating. It just would make the post-heat treating cleanup that much more difficult if you only ground with the 24. The 24 really leaves some deep scratch marks or grind lines on the bevel. Anyway, using this tilt table, very easy. It holds the blade at the desired bevel angle, and then you just really move the blade up into contact with the belt and then pull it from side to side. Because you're following visually the scribed center line, it's going to naturally follow the profile or the curve of the blade. It does take a little bit of practice to get used to it, but it's a very, very simple way of really obtaining some nice bevels. And grinding a bevel really is the heart of the knife making project. You know, a lot of people freehand their bevels, and a lot of those actually start out with a tilt table. They establish the bevel on the tilt table, and then after heat treating, they'll freehand the bevels following that same established bevel angle. So we're still on that 1/4 inch blade. I've gone both sides. I've established the bevel. I'm just evening it out a little bit, and then I went to the 60 grit belt, and I'm taking away, you know, some of those really deeper bevel grind lines. So that's the first blade done. And the whole beveling process on this, you know, even though it's a thick blade, maybe it took 10 minutes. You know, say 15 just for kicks. I don't even think it took that long. I think it took about 10 minutes to rough bevel both sides. Now this next knife is thinner, so I'm not going to use that coarse grit, you know, 24 or 36 grit belt. I'm just going to do the entire bevel using a 60 grit belt. And then after the 60, I will clean it up with an 80 grit before I put this one aside for heat treating. This is a recurve blade, and not difficult, but it does take a little bit of practice with the tilt table. You're basically just creating two different curves, you know, an inner curve and an outer curve. You can grind the bevel on one section at a time. If you just wanted to do the tip, you could grind the entire tip almost right down to those scribe lines. As long as the last couple of passes are fluid from one side to the other, you'll end up with a nice bevel. And again, the entire time you're really just keeping a very, very close eye on the scribed railroad tracks on the edge of the blade. If that's uniform, you know, if you're grinding uniformly to that line and not grinding through it or not leaving material, you know, in one area that's on one side of that line, your bevels are going to come out uniform and even. So that's rough bevel number 2. And this, you know, basically everything that you're seeing here is 2 hours after work in the garage. Now, because these knives are stainless, they are going to get heat treated in a heat treating oven. And the first step in that process, I'm not going to go through the whole process, but the first step is going to be to wrap these in a stainless tool wrap. The whole thought here is to make that envelope, that stainless steel tool wrap envelope, as airtight as possible. So you do that by double folding each seam and really creasing the seam down tight, you know, with a heavy object. Then in a heat treating oven, stainless gets heat treated for very precise time and temperature requirements, you know, depending on the type of stainless that you're using. If you're grinding high carbon steel, you don't have to do any of this. You just heat treat it in a forge and quench in oil. So these blades are going into the heat treating oven. They're going to stay in there. They're going to get up to temperature, and then they're going to soak for 15 minutes. And then I cool these blades, or quench the blades, called plate quenching. I clamp them between 2 aluminum plates, and then I blow compressed air over and under and around the blade to get it to cool off as quickly as possible. A lot of guys will use solid plates. I kind of like the tubing. And the reason I like the tubing is not only does it keep the blade nice and flat, but I can blow compressed air through the tube, and it just allows me to cool off the blade that much faster. And then after this plate quenching, they're going to go in for a sub-zero quench. I'm going to use dry ice for these, and then they'll go in for 2 tempering cycles in my wife's kitchen oven. 395 degrees for 2 hours times 2 cycles. I'm just going to cut these blades out, of the tool wrap. I use tin snips for this. Just find it the easiest way to do it. Find out how good a job you did on the airtight envelope. If there's a lot of slag on it, you didn't do too good a job. These are pretty decent. So that's this episode. We're going to come back and take a look at finishing up each of these knives on the next video. I hope you enjoyed this short little video on the current whips, current works in progress in my garage. If you did, I ask that you please give a thumbs up and maybe leave a comment. I'd like to invite you to our Facebook group, Knives and Knife Making. And by all means, if you're interested in learning how to make a knife, check out the book that Jason Northgard and I put out last year called Introduction to Knife Making. And that can be found on Amazon.com. Thank you very much.